Okay, thank you for being patient. Welcome to Wine and Cheese Pairing. So we're talking about the cheese and the wine. So we're talking about the similarity of the product that we'll discuss, the what, the where, the when, of course. We'll talk about the composition of both cheese and wine and why these things do go together. We'll talk about general pairing guidelines. So there are really, of course, two ways to approach the idea of food and wine pairing, right? Now, in pre-COVID times, you would go out, especially in New York or, LA or San Francisco, to your Michelin-starred restaurant. You'd be offered a chef tasting menu with the wine pairings to go with it. And I think, well, this is a very, very cool way to dine when you have a chef and a sommelier or a beverage director who sits and tastes wine and food together and pairs this perfect experience for you. It's not necessarily realistic for learning how to pair food and wine in the real world. At one time, it is quite complex, but it's much less complex than trying every ingredient with every wine and really seeing what goes together. We can really pair a large variety of foods or cheeses with a large variety of wine. So if we were to come to you and say, you have to only buy, Cave X washed rind blank, whatever, and then you buy only that brand of this type of cheese that was made in this month, and then you pair it with, Domain X 2017, blah, blah, and we told you those two things go together, well, they might, right? Maybe we tasted that last week and we're like, wow, this is incredible. But what if we tell you to get that and you try to recreate that pairing next month or a year from now or 3 years from now, and you have the cheese in a different season or the wine is a different vintage, those things may not inherently be absolutely wonderful together, that one pairing that we tried. So what we really want to do is offer you the service of teaching you about, again, the composition of certain types of foods like cheese and the composition of specific types of wine and how you compare those together at home. Another kind of disservice that's been done by the idea of these, chef tasting menus with specific pairings is also the idea that we don't inherently know how to pair food and wine, which also isn't true. You instinctively pair things to go with your food or with your beverages at home every day. When you add acidic jelly to your kind of fatty, nut butter sandwich, when you squeeze a wedge of lemon over something you over salted, you kind of naturally do this when you're making a salad dressing of any type of acidity in your cupboard, be it lemons, limes, some type of vinegar and olive oil, right? So you kind of naturally do this at home. So we kind of really need to begin to trust our own instincts when it comes to pairing. Do you like this together, right? We'll talk about types of cheese. Will we talk about every cheese? I wish we could, but we won't. But we'll talk about kind of the most general categories of cheese that you do find that are also easy to find. Hopefully, people are coming to us from all over the US, sometimes other countries. And it would also be a disservice to suggest a specific type of cheese that you can't find, right? Maybe in that particular area. What you can find in Vermont or New York City is probably very different than what you might find in Ohio or Nevada, right? And then we'll talk about specific pairing suggestions. And again, we're not going to do like the Cave X with Domain X specifically. We're going to talk more about general cheeses and general styles of wine that we do suggest you look towards pairing together. All right, fantastic. So today what we were suggesting, so if you were sent wine from Corkbuzz, you received a Chardonnay coming from France, and you received a Zinfandel coming from California. We'll talk about those wines at the end of the presentation, just because I think, for wine to be great, you really need to have some context about what makes it great, right? So we'll talk about these wines at the end, but we really believe that they're the styles of wine that pair well with many different types of cheeses. So whatever you found at home to have with those wines, we hope you'll do a little experimenting. We recommended a number of cheeses. You don't need to have all of these cheeses at your disposal right now. Maybe you don't like all of these styles, but if you were building a cheese plate for a party, right? How would you do that? Well, one, you want many different types of cheese to suit every palate. The thing about a cheese plate is the visual art of it too, right? So you want those kind of striking blue colors. You want some of those soft kind of runny cheeses or oozy cheeses. You want some hard cheeses that have more geometric design to them as you cut them. So we think about kind of triple creams or other fatty cheeses. This could be things like ricotta. This could be things like brie or camembert. Goat cheese, really popular, especially the fresh style that you see coming in logs. They tend to be tangy, as do sheep's milk cheeses. They tend to really kind of reflect the grass that the animal has eaten. So we say often that goat and sheep milk cheeses have this sort of kind of grassy, tangy characteristic to them. We keep that in mind when we're thinking about which wines we might decide to pair. Blue cheese. Not everybody likes blue cheese. Some people love it. We'll tell you what to drink if you love a blue cheese and you want to almost exacerbate that kind of like salty and earthy characteristic you get with blue. But we'll also tell you what to drink if you want to sort of reduce some of the funkiness of blue cheese, right? And blue cheese comes in many different styles. So you can have a triple cream blue, something like Cambozola, which I really love. I would call it blue for beginners. Or you can have something like Roquefort, right? That has a lot of bluing to it, definitely more on the funky and earthy side. A hard cheese, something like Pecorino, Parmesan, Grana Padano, and aged cheddar. Any of these sort of more firm, dry, and kind of harder cheeses will do well here. A sweet nutty cheese, something kind of like a Gouda, could be really fantastic. Euphoria in this particular case. Other types of cheddar that have maybe been aged to a little sweetness. Sometimes you might also think about cheeses that have flavorings added to them, right? Sometimes you see those kind of blueberry or truffle cheeses, things like that. And then washed drying cheeses. So washed drying cheeses, we'll talk about all these cheeses more in their personal characteristics, but washed drying cheeses are funky. These are your kind of like feety, kind of stinky feet, smelly cheeses, right? Very oftentimes people think of them as being very French. A lot of these cheeses that have washed drying do come from France. Wines that we suggested, of course, we mentioned that we are talking about a Chardonnay, and we're talking about a Zinfandel coming from Corkbuzz today, but sparkling wine. Sparkling wine is fantastic with cheese, especially younger, fresh, richer, fattier cheeses. We'll talk about why. If you don't have sparkling or you don't prefer sparkling, Cava, Cremant, Champagne, any light or high acid white wine will do. So we're thinking things like Sancerre, Riesling, Chablis, Chardonnay coming from northern France, right? These are all great examples of high acid white wines. You might think of a fuller bodied wine. I love, of course, richer Chardonnay coming from further south in France. We might think about Chardonnay from Australia, New Zealand, America, South Africa. We also might think of kind of fuller bodied white wines like Marsanne or Roussanne, maybe something like Viognier that has a little bit of fruitiness to it, right? Fuller bodied red wines that are lower in tannin. So Zinfandel, Amarone or Ripasso coming from Italy. We could talk about things like Grenache and New World's Shiraz or Syrah with a lot of fruit character. We'll talk about different styles of sweet wine. We have in the kind of nutty category, we have port, we have Madeira, we have sherry. It can be sweet or not sweet, right? But they all have a nuttiness to them, kind of like the candied walnuts, almonds, a cashew characteristic. If any of you are from New York and you think about the nut stand that's always on the corner with the hot nuts, right? The kind of candied mixed cashew, peanuts, almonds, all of those great things. And then you have your kind of honeyed sweet wines, right? So if you like honey with your cheese, what type of wine would you like with that? Sauterne, Tokai, Bonazou, Coeur de Cham, right? Coteau du Léon, any of these sort of German ice wines would do really well. Beerenauslese, Auslese, Trockenbeerenauslese styles of sweet wine from Germany. These are all styles that tend to have a more honeyed character to them. So these might be some of the styles you have at home. Again, if you do, please talk to your friends about what you're drinking. So the what, the where, and the when. What makes these styles so similar? Overall, they are similar products. When it comes to the idea of both products, wine and cheese. Wine comes from a living grape, and cheese comes from the milk of a living animal. They both sort of adhere to the concept of terroir. The concept of terroir, of course, is the kind of the total growing environment. So in one case, we're thinking about the growing environment of a grapevine and the wine that's made from those grapes that reflect the soil, the climate, the weather, the sunshine, the rain, everything that it gets from the soil, right? And with cheese, it's the milk coming from the animal and whatever they're eating in that specific terroir. So again, that grass, that vegetation is really influenced by, again, the soil, the sunshine, the rainfall, the climate, the weather of that particular year. This is also why we see a lot of seasonality in cheese. So wine, of course, we get one harvest a year, and a lot of specific types of cheeses are made in a very certain or specific season as well. Some of my favorite cheeses that come out of New York, or that we get in New York that come out of places like Vermont, are only made in certain types of year. And I literally wait all year for like Windermere season, which starts in January. So they both kind of reflect the soul of the soil. Both wine and cheese reflect the terroir, but both the wine and the cheese that are finished are altered by the choices that the winemaker or cheesemaker, uses, the choices and the techniques that they use during making these items. They're both still alive when you purchase them. Cheese changes in your refrigerator. It continues to age as it sits there, right? And the same with wine. Take wine, store it in your cellar, under your bed, wherever you keep your wine, and it will change and evolve in the bottle. And so do cheese. So they're both alive, they both change, and they're both really can be enhanced by proper storage and proper temperature of serving. Now, I really do think that the serving temperature of cheese is really important. Most of the time, we want cheese to come to room temperature. This really helps it show at its best. And when we say things like room temperature, right, we often say, well, serve wine at room temperature. Well, all temperatures of rooms are different, but we really want to think about room temperature as being somewhere between, let's say, like 65 and 69 degrees. And now, not everybody here is going to agree with me that that's the perfect room temperature, but we don't want it to be too hot that firmer cheeses like cheddar or Colby or Gruyere start sweating, and we don't want it to be too hot that softer cheeses start melting, right? So we're not looking for a hot room, but kind of a not too cold and not too warm, just the right Goldilocks temperature room for cheese and wine service. And we want to store them both correctly. We want to store cheese in your refrigerator correctly, wrapped, but not certainly sometimes not so airtight. And then you also want to keep cheese at the right storage, or excuse me, wine at the right storage temperature as well. So what's the composition of these things? Are they made of the same ingredients? Of course they're not. But you can see as we go through this, how the composition of them enhances the other when you have these two things made together. So cheese comes from the milk of an animal, of course, and within that milk are protein, fat, minerals, and vitamins. We begin the process of making cheese from milk by mixing the milk with bacteria and rennet. And we'll talk about cheese making here in a second, but this is what begins the first step of making cheese, which is creating the curd. We take milk, and when we add rennet and some sort of bacteria to create the curdling, we separate the whey, and the cheese curds cheese curds are what we're going to use to eventually make the cheese. There are various cheese making techniques. So when we begin to concentrate the curd, we start using these different techniques to affect the finished style of the wine. Why are cheeses so incredibly different, right? Like, should we have more than one word for cheese? Because cheese is pretty vague, but at the same time, so is wine. Wine is such a vague descriptor for a really diverse category of beverages and flavors and textures, right? And experiences for wine. Cheese can be sold young and fresh, but it can also be aged. This also affects the flavor and also the texture of the cheese as you enjoy it. With cheese, the longer it ages, the more intense the flavor becomes. You might have the opportunity, I think something that's really fun, if you're in New York, one of my favorite restaurants is Casa Mono and Bar Hamon, and they sometimes will serve 3 different styles of manchego at different ages, you know, like 60 days or 30 days, 60 days, 90 days type of thing, right? Or maybe that might not be the exact progression of the age, but you really can try the same cheese at the different ages that it has, which can be really fun. So we get the more intense flavor as we age cheese longer. And the characteristics run the gamut, right? We have fruity character or flavors in cheese. It can be earthy, salty. Some cheeses are very salty, some are less salty. All cheese is salted. This is a preservative for the cheese itself. They can be tangy, right? A little bit more tart or acidic. The cheese can be very dry and crumbly, or it can be moist and soft or whipped. It can be very intense, or it can be mellow, and cheese can be firm or soft. When it comes to the composition of wine, we have water, alcohol, acids, sugar, minerals, and phenols within the wine. This affects the flavor, the texture, the sweetness of the wine itself. We have acidity that helps cut through fat or protein in cheese, right? We really need that. We start making wine by mixing the juice that comes from the grapes with yeast that creates the fermentation, finish it for the wine. But after the fermentation, we have various winemaking techniques, just like our cheese making techniques, right? Do we stir the leaves and create a creamy character in the wine like we do for Chardonnay? Do we use oak to add more flavor? Things like cinnamon, clove, vanilla, nutmeg, cedar, butterscotch, smoke characteristics, right? Do we do these different things? Do we age in stainless steel that preserves more fruit flavors, or do we age in used oak, which gives us a little bit more earthy, nutty flavors? Wine can be sold young and fresh or aged, just like cheese. The winemaker can make that decision by holding wine back at the property and releasing it after it's been aged, like we see in places like Barolo, Barbaresco, Brunello di Montalcino, or Rioja. For longer aging for wine, we tend to develop more subtle flavor, or maybe we shouldn't say develop, right? Maybe what we're really seeing is the lessening of more intense flavors. So longer aging for cheese, more intense flavor, longer aging for wine, more subtle flavor. A lot of those really fresh fruit flavors in younger wine tend to mellow out over time. They can become a little bit more fresh, or dried flavors, a little bit more complex, right? But we also have characters that are fruity, earthy. They're also dry or sweet when it comes to wine. We have tannic and acidic wine. Wine can be bold or subtle, and they can be full or light bodied. So we're starting to see a little bit of a repetition here, right? Why these things might go together. So what types of cheeses do we have? We listed the styles of cheese that we recommended earlier. And what does that mean, right? What is a young, fresh, soft cheese? So you have different categories of cheeses. Most of us like fresh cheese. These are your cheeses that are young. They tend to be tangy. They're smooth. They're often moist because we haven't pressed a lot of the whey out of the cheese. There might be a little bit left. These cheeses tend to be uncooked and unripened. or very lightly ripened. So fresh cheeses would include things like ricotta. They would include, of course, things like feta would be a really great example. They would include things like farmer cheese that you get at the market on a Saturday, right? These kind of younger, fresher styles of cheese. Because these cheeses don't age very long, because they tend to be unripened style of cheeses, the quality of the milk that you use is really important, because these cheeses will taste a little bit more like the milk itself, because they haven't had time to develop the same sort of flavor we see in other cheeses. We have bloomy rind cheeses. So these are things like your brie or your camembert style cheeses that you might find. So bloomy rind cheeses tend to be kind of soft ripened from the outside in. So we do age these cheeses for a period of time, usually in a small wheel. And on the inside, they become buttery and rich, but kind of fluffy. The flavor usually tends to stay mild. It might be a little bit mushroomy in character. And these cheeses ripen from the outside in. So they really kind of develop a thin but very velvety rind to the cheese itself. So the bloomy rind is allowed to develop on these cheeses. Now, because these cheeses ripen from the outside in, the inside of the cheese will always be the most mild. And if you get closer to the crust or the rind, you'll see more flavor in that. Now, almost all cheese rind is edible, especially naturally made cheeses. When you see like, Baby Bell, of course, coated in wax, certainly those things are not edible. But even on really firm kind of cheese rinds, it's all a part of the cheese. So sometimes it's not necessarily pleasant to enjoy on your palate, but none of them will actually hurt you. They're all part of the cheese itself. We have semi-soft cheeses. These are your pliable, your melty, your earthy kind of styles of cheese. They tend to be cooked or heated for a short period of time, and then they're pressed or ladled into molds. And as we press the cheese, we begin to expel more moisture, and cheeses begin to become firmer. So when we ladle a cheese into a mold, think something like maybe your goat's milk log, your chevroi, you might notice that it's kind of cakey and pasty, and it's in a log because it's been aged inside of that. When I say mold, I mean like your circle or your square that you pour your cheese into, not mold that grows. Kind of confusing because we use it in tandem two ways here, right? So you have your chevroi log. It doesn't really have a rind to it because it was made inside of a mold, if that makes sense. We have your washed rind cheeses. We talked about this before. Your stinky, your feedy, your meaty, your intense styles of cheese, that picture that we all saw in the newspaper as kids, where somebody walks into a cheese shop in France and wants to know who has their shoes off. Now, this is a very common style of creating and preserving cheese. Washed rinds go a little bit further than your bloomy rind cheeses. So they also ripen from the outside in. They also tend to have a softer center. These can often be kind of oozy, especially if you leave them out on the counter for a period of time. But the rind is incredibly pungent. This is because they actually spray that rind with some sort of solution. So this could be kind of a saltwater brine, it could be beer, wine, or an eau de vie, native to a particular region. Somewhere like Burgundy, they'll use a Marc de Bourgogne, a brandy that they make within Burgundy from grapes, essentially. They'll use that to spray the outside of a pois, and that's what makes the pois so funky and stinky, right? Because this creates more area for bacteria to grow, give bacteria more food, and as that bacteria develops, all good for you, it creates more aroma on the outside of that cheese. So if you like funky cheeses, you'll probably go straight for the rind. But again, if maybe you want to see what the inside of that ripened cheese is like, they tend to be a little bit more kind of peanut buttery and can be really delicious. You might try just a little bit of the inside. Try some of the cheese that's further away from the rind on a washed rind if you don't want as funky of a flavor. We also have firm cheeses, your dense, supple cheeses that can be kind of fruity and sharp. These are sort of cheddar styles of cheeses, right? And so when I say cheddar, yes, I'm talking about cheddar. Yes, I'm talking about Colby, but it's a particular way of making the cheese where we cook and press the cheese, and then we cut it over and over into cubes and continue to press it. So this creates this dense but really kind of supple interior. So it's called cheddaring the cheese, the process of making it. We make finer and finer curds of cheese for this. So they're a little bit tighter, a little bit denser. We have aged cheeses that tend to get dry, crunchy, grainy. Sometimes they develop more of your caramel butterscotch characteristic. These cheeses are also cooked, pressed, and aged. And with that age, they do become drier. We lose more of that moisture. If anybody here does have issues with dairy, oftentimes you're not as bothered by aged cheeses, where a lot of that whey has come out of the product itself. And of course, we have blue cheeses. These are uncooked cheeses. We need to allow enough space within the cheese. We don't want the curd to be as tight, so that we can actually pierce the cheese with hollow needles. And this gives the cheese veins that allow for bluing. So this is how you get such different styles of blue, right? All different sizes of hollow needles, all different ways to puncture the cheese itself to allow for this bluing. But blue cheeses do tend to be both salty and sweet and kind of earthy and sharp and punchy at the same time. Is there anybody who's like not a fan of blue cheese at all? Sometimes we have, those that really love blue cheese, those that don't. When I was young, I would always be like, God, I can't believe my mom liked blue cheese. What is this? It's so disgusting. And, as I aged and found ways to enjoy it and kind of worked my way in from those beginner blue cheeses like Cambozola, I've really come to enjoy them. So we'll talk about the process of cheese making, but we've kind of mentioned a lot of this, but I think it's important to know how we make these different types of products, right? So the first thing, as I mentioned, we create the curd. So this is where we take the milk of the animal. We can use cow, goat, sheep, water buffalo, and many other types of kind of local animals or specialties for cheese. We add rennet, come from the belly of ruminant animals, but this helps to coagulate the milk. And when we coagulate the milk, we are able to separate those solid curd, which will become our cheese, and the liquid whey. And in most cases, we don't use whey. We might add a little bit back into maybe whipped cheese sometimes, but typically we use the whey for something else. You find it in all types of other products. So if you're dairy sensitive, which I would imagine most people in this class are not, you might look for whey on labels because that is actually dairy. So the curd is what we use to create that cheese. If we were making ricotta, we would essentially be almost like stopping here, right? We have just the curd. Usually that's what ricotta is. We might whip in a little bit of whey to make it creamier. That's what we do at Corkbuzz. But essentially we have our kind of our fresh cheese. But most cheeses go on to the next step, which is concentrating the curd, which we've talked about. So we usually heat the curd, and depending on how high you heat it, it becomes harder, changes the taste, might create more of that caramelized flavor or texture as well, because what happens when you cook food, you caramelize it. That's what happens. We salt it. The salt is for preservation. And then we really decide to shape the cheese. So it's also during this part, we might cheddar the cheese where we're cutting it, piling it, pressing it over and over to create a denser style of cheese. We're making something like mozzarella. This is the point that we would start stretching it, right? Over and over and over until we're at the consistency that we enjoy. But also this is the point that we're going to decide on the shape of our cheese. They're going to be a wheel, a log, a square, a triangle, a dome, help me out. There's all sorts of different shapes of cheeses that you might see here, right? So we decide on the shape of our cheese, whether it needs to go into some sort of mold to hold its shape. Sometimes we wrap cheeses in things like different types of bark from trees to add flavor and complexity. And then we decide to send our cheese for ripening. And this is really where we start to determine what the final flavor of the cheese might be and the final texture. But a lot of the texture is decided during this curd processing stage. So we take our cheese, we store it, we age it. We might wash the rinds. We might let the bloom or kind of bloomy rind cheeses, right? Our brie or camembert develop. We might pat those down a little bit over time in these perfect cellars. And then we send our cheeses out into the world to be enjoyed. So let's talk about some general pairing guidelines. Again, we would be doing you a disservice to only tell you that one type of cheese and one type of wine go together when that is certainly not true. If you are a novice at food and wine pairing, at cheese and wine pairing, one of the best rules, and this is really important for cheese and wine especially, is what grows together goes together, right? So this is really the idea, just like kind of the soul of the soil, right? The milk from the animal, the grape from the soil, the wine from the grape, that these things evolved in perpetuity over time together, right? The wine culture and the food culture of regions really evolved together. And that has a lot to do with the cheese and the wine that evolved together in a particular region too. Why do we eat a pois with red Burgundy, right? They evolved together in the same region. Why do we enjoy Sancerre and Loire Valley goat cheese, Cheviot, things like that? They evolved together. We have a kind of rich, dense, sort of pasty cheese when it comes to goat cheese, right? And it has a grassy tang to it. What do we have with Sauvignon Blanc? We have a high acid, or Sancerre, a high acid white wine, helps cut through the richness of that fat, the richness of that cheese, but also matches the grassy flavor of the Sauvignon Blanc to the grassy flavor of the cheese. So what grows together goes together. We find this really, really can be one of the best ways to think about pairing. And when you go to your cheese counter, you know, so many small grocery stores even have cheese counters, and larger grocery stores, you can go to Whole Foods and usually they have a counter with somebody to talk to about cheese. You can go to Chelsea Market, Fairway, Greene Grape. You know, a lot of these grocery stores really do have cheese counters where there's somebody that you can talk to. You can tell them what wine you're purchasing, or you can tell them the style of cheese that you want, and they might be able to make recommendations for you. We like to cut salty foods with sweet wine. We love salty and sweet together, right? We do this all the time. Again, we constantly pair things without even realizing we're doing it. We take oysters and we, you know, might have them sometimes even with a little bit of sweet wine could be really good. Something kind of a nice sauterne or something can be really fantastic. We take ice cream and we put it together with salty cookie dough, right? Sweet ice cream, salty cookie dough. We take Thai fish cakes that are salty and we cover them with Thai chili sauce, which has sweetness to it and a little bit of heat. We constantly pair these kind of sweet and salty things. Nutella and pretzels. We use salt and acid. This is actually what I really wanted to say when I would like oysters, and then I would like oysters and sweet oysters and sauterne, but I actually think that that would be really good together, and I'm going to try it. But we talk about salty and acidic, right? Acid cuts saltiness. This is why we use lemon with oysters. This is why we take our fried food that's both salty and fatty, and we squeeze a lemon wedge over it to cut that salt, to cut that fat, right? Acid cuts fat, acid cuts salt. Really important here. That's why we have all manners of fried food with champagne. Bubbles, texture from the champagne matches the texture of the fried crust. But more importantly, that high acid in champagne and cava and Cremant cut through the fattiness and the saltiness of whatever we have on top of that fried food. We cut tannins with fat. You make black tea, you oversteep it. It's too tannic or bitter, you add a little bit of milk or cream to soften the attack of those tannins, right? So that's why with a lot of tannic wines, Sangiovese, Cabernet Sauvignon, Nebbiolo, Aglianico, We eat those with meat because those are tannic wines, and meat, red meat especially, has a lot of fat to it. It helps cut a lot of that tannin in the wine itself. We also talk about acid with fat. I mentioned this also with the salt, fried food, right? We're cutting that fried food with that lemon wedge. You don't need the lemon wedge. You can use any high acid wine. Sancerre, Sauvignon Blanc, Chablis, you know, European Chardonnay, all manners of sparkling wine, Muscadet, all of these things can help be cut. All of these wine can help cut the richness of fat. And then we also think about pairing complex wines with complex foods. You don't want to pair really complex food with a non-complex wine unless you really want only the food to shine, right? You might want the food to take center stage, so you'll think about maybe letting the wine hang back. But generally, we want to say, you know, subtle with subtle. You don't want to have your fillet of Dover sole maybe with the Cabernet Sauvignon. And some people like those flavors together, but the Cabernet Sauvignon would really kind of overwhelm the delicate nature of the fish, right? So we would want to have that fillet with something a little bit more subtle. And the opposite is powerful with powerful. Certainly, let's say you're having a really fantastic ribeye on the bone. Maybe you went to Beatrice Inn and that ribeye is $600. You're probably not going to want to pair that with something like a delicate Riesling that is delicious on its own or with other food, but would really be overwhelmed by that steak, right? The steak comes with the $600 because it has truffle butter and it comes on a silver platter and it would dry age for 160 days and it has shaved white truffles on top, right? All of those flavors are delicious, but they're just a little bit too powerful for that Riesling. You want to match it with, you know, a Brunello di Montalcino or something that has enough strength to really stand up to that. So when we're thinking about pairing things together, we want to kind of think about the general texture rules as well. So let's see, I don't see any questions. If anybody has some, please don't hesitate to let me know. So I'd love to hear about what you're enjoying together. I'd love to hear about, and everybody has their own palate, right? We'll talk about this at the end, but what works for me won't work for everybody else, and vice versa. So it's really important to honor your own palate and what you like. And also make sure you're enjoying cheese and wine with the right people. So let's talk about kind of these still general but more specific ways that we can think about pairing food and wine. So you can look at it two ways, or cheese and wine really, what we'll talk about. So you can always look at it from the point of the food or the cheese, or from the point of the wine. I think it's more common with cheese that we'll probably choose the wine first because cheese does not last as long in our refrigerator as wine. If you store it correctly, certainly it can last. You can buy a wheel, right? And you can eat that wheel for a month if it's stored correctly, certainly. But I think more often we think about what wine we're having and then maybe what cheese we're pairing with it. So sparkling wines tend to have high acidity. Sparkling wine grapes are harvested earlier. They retain more acidity. They need that kind of mouth-watering, sharp texture of the wine to stand up to the bubbles. So what are we talking about when we talk about a sparkling wine? In this case, we'll talk about sparkling sweet wines at the end, but we think about things like champagne. Champagne comes from France. We think about things like Cremant. Cremant also comes from France. This is a style of sparkling wine that's made like champagne, but not in the region of Champagne, but elsewhere in France. We might think about Cava. Cava is a sparkling wine also made like champagne, but coming from Spain, right? So what do we mean when we say like champagne? 2 fermentations, the second one in the bottle, which gives champagne, Cremant, and Cava a little bit more of a toasty or brioche flavor than you get with something like Prosecco that's not made in that character. Can you use Prosecco? Yes, of course, for pairing with cheese. Prosecco will usually be more fruity and will oftentimes, but not always, have a little bit more sweetness to it than you get with champagne or Cava. There are some styles of Prosecco that are made in the same style as Champagne, but they're much more rare. And they'll be much more expensive than kind of your everyday brunch style of Prosecco, right? We can think about high acid white wine, Sancerre, Sauvignon Blanc. Sancerre is Sauvignon Blanc. It's named for the place. And I think that's important too. So we didn't mention this before, is we talked about both wine and cheese at the terroir, the soul of the soil, the terroir. Well, both are named for the region of which they come from, right? Or they both are named as an appellation, I guess is what I should say. So because both tend to be regional specialties, they can only be called a Place if it's made in Burgundy in that way, right? It can only be called Roquefort if it comes from a specific area. It can only be called Gouda if it's made in a specific way. So just like Sancerre can only be Sauvignon Blanc to be called Sancerre, Chevroi can only be goat cheese from Loire to be called goat cheese, to be called Chevroi, right? So we think about that idea. Sancerre, Sauvignon Blanc, cool climate, high acid, really great with those fattier styles of cheese. And again, those fresh styles of cheese, right? Things that are a little bit more kind of grassy, a little bit more floral and characteristic. Riesling, you think about the flavor of Riesling. It tends to be a little bit more on the peachy, honeyed side. If you're the type of person that likes to take a little bit of your brie and add some peach jam, you probably really enjoy this with Riesling, which tend to have some of those peach flavors, right? If you like to have your brie or your camembert with some apple slices, what might you actually enjoy with that camembert or that brie, right? Maybe you'd enjoy Chablis, Chardonnay coming from Northern Burgundy. Maybe you'd enjoy Chardonnay from Burgundy or Macon or elsewhere in France. I tend to, with cheese, I tend to prefer European styles of Chardonnay, not because other styles aren't great, but I think that it help to retain some of that brighter acidity than you might find in places like California or Australia, South America, for example. Does this mean that all wines or all Chardonnay from kind of warmer countries, like the US or like the Americas, like Australia, like New Zealand, like South Africa, that we can't use these styles of Chardonnay? Of course not. But they might be a little bit more bombastic and slightly richer. So the acidity will be a little bit lower. They might not cut through the fat quite as much. Chenin Blanc can also be fantastic. Again, think about your Loire Valley cheeses. It's an area that has a lot of sheep, a lot of goats within the area, also a lot of cows. A lot of the Chenins here can be really great. I love aged styles of cheese from Loire with wines like Sauvignon, right? Chenin Blanc coming from Sauvignon, a little bit more nutty and characteristic. Be great with Arnaise and Burrata, already a little bit nutty, slightly more savory in character as well. But these high acid white wines really tend to be great with these softer, creamy, more buttery cheeses. Again, the bubbles or the acidity really help cut through the rich fat. And as far as white wines go, these tend to be a little bit more delicate in their flavors, right? And we're talking about cheeses that tend to be slightly more delicate as well. Now, what doesn't this work with? Do all cheeses and wine work together? Of course not. I mean, the great thing is you try it, and if you don't like it, you choose a different cheese or a different wine. So if you're having, friends over in your pod for like a cheese and wine night, make sure you have a couple of different wines open, right? You have 4 people over, open 2 or 3 bottles for people to taste the different wines with the different cheeses. But typically, these lighter, fresher styles of wine don't go as well with the strong, funky cheeses. Again, we want to do, subtle with subtle, and then more powerful with more powerful. So the stronger washed rind blue cheeses will often overwhelm the more delicate kind of aroma and flavor that we might find in these lighter whites. So full body, low tannin, semi-soft cheeses. Overall, sometimes we say that white wines tend to go better with cheese overall. But maybe that's because we tend to think of more tannic red wine when we talk about red wines, right? We talk about Italian red wines. We talk about Cabernet Sauvignon. We talk about Bordeaux. These are all tannic styles of wine. When it comes to pairing with cheese, maybe you know that somebody at the party that you're going to is making a cheese plate, but you don't know what's on it. This is going to be one of your best bets. Again, full-bodied, so a little bit more lower acidity, slightly lower acidity, lower tannin wine, and maybe a little bit more alcohol. So we might think of kind of warm climate styles of wine. Zinfandel coming from California, Amarone or Ripasso coming from the Veneto in Italy. We think about more plush styles of Merlot, especially coming from Alexander Valley or Sonoma or Napa can be really fantastic. Grenache, love Grenache. Think about Chateauneuf-du-Pape, any of the Côte du Rhône, Southern Rhône. You have a kind of richer sun-kissed style of what's almost like Pinot Noir flavors. If you like, again, think of what kind of jam do you like? If you like strawberry and raspberry styles of jam, you'll probably like to have Grenache with your cheese, right? If you like mixed berry jam, maybe you'll be thinking about Malbec. You tend to have more plum and darker fruit flavor than Malbec. Like if you took every fruit, you put them in a blender. You might think about Montepulciano coming from Italy, both a little bit earthy, but kind of moderate in tannin or lower in tannin. And then Shiraz. If you have Syrah coming from the Northern Rhone, it might be a little bit firmer in its tannic structure, but if you're thinking Shiraz from Australia, California, you'll be thinking about a little bit of a softer palate. So what happens here? We use these wines with more savory and salty cheeses. We're taking a little bit of this fruit and we're balancing that, the fruit in the cheese. What do we put on cheese plates? Fruit compote, right? If you have these wines, you don't need the compote. You have the fruit with the Gouda, a little bit of a caramelized cheese, your Gruyere, your Havarti, your Morbier, your Mimolette. It really can add the kind of beautiful fruitiness and complexity to these styles of cheese. And because they're lower in tannin, they don't clash with the little bit of the firmer palate of some of these cheeses. These don't tend to work as well with soft cheeses. They really don't work well with goat cheeses, but I do sometimes really like some of these fruitier or slightly funky styles of wine with washed rind cheeses. And I'll tell you why, and not everybody does, but I really like to do like a New World Grenache or a California Pinot Noir with a washed rind cheese. And the reason I really enjoy this is because you have the funkiness of the cheese. They tend to be really peanut buttery. If you don't believe me, go out, get a washed rind cheese. Tasty inside, it tastes like peanut butter. When you add a Grenache that tastes like strawberry jam to a washed rind cheese that tastes like peanut butter, what do you have? The perfect marriage of peanut butter and jelly, right? They taste so good together. And I think that fruitiness can help temper some of those funky flavors as well. So it doesn't always work with every fruity wine and every washed rind cheese, but I think that it works often enough that I like to recommend it. Now, a lot of us drink full-bodied tannic red wine. These tend to go well with aged cheeses. A lot of these styles of wine are usually aged, right? Cabernet Sauvignon we like with age, coming from Bordeaux, coming from California. But we're talking about Sangiovese, Nebbiolo, or Aglianico, or Tempranillo coming from Rioja. Most of these wines, by law, from the region that they come from, are aged. They work with aged cheeses. When we think about cheddars, tend to be aged, right? We think about Parmesan and Pecorino, Grana Padano coming from Tuscany or coming from Piedmont. These are styles of cheese that are very firm because of that, the aging process that's gone into them. They become firmer over time, and they have these kind of nutty, savory flavors that go really well with the more savory flavor you get in aged wine, right? That Sangiovese, that Nebbiolo. I really, really love Rioja, a Reserva or a Gran Reserva with aged Manchego, shows really well together. But these aged style of cheeses often don't work with, again, those really fresh these aged styles of wine don't always work with these fresher styles of cheese, right? We're not thinking about our feta. We're not thinking about kind of salty cheeses. Ricotta salata would tend to be a little bit more salty, but with maybe a fresh ricotta that's not too salty, you might enjoy something like Sangiovese or Nebbiolo, but overall, it's not always as good of a pair as it is with these aged styles of cheese. Aged wine, aged cheese, fresh, bright, high acid white wine, fresh, bright cheeses, right? We're seeing a little bit of a theme here when it comes to this. So dessert wines are so often overlooked at the end of a meal. Why are dessert wines great? I'll tell you right now, because they have sugar and acidity. So they can usually stay in your fridge open for much longer than a kind of traditional still wine or like red or white table wine, right? Sherry, port, Madeira, Banyuls, Muscat, Sauterne, Tokay. Some of these are fortified wines. They also have additional alcohol to them. This isn't about getting drunker. This is about the fact that it fortifies the wine, right? What happens when you fortify wine? You make it stronger. So these wines are stronger. They can last on your shelf or in your refrigerator after you've opened them. So if you're thinking, wow, I just got this beautiful piece of blue cheese, I have this great bottle of port, but I know I'm not going to drink it all tonight, that's okay. You don't need to. You can hang on to that port, or, I mean, I wouldn't say indefinitely, but I would say if you wanted to open a bottle of port and drink it over the next 3 to 6 months, if you stored it correctly, you can certainly do that. So you can have this wine for when you want to buy these kind of blue styles of cheese. So why do we like these sweet wines with blue cheese? Well, we mentioned before, blue is salty. It can be bitter. It can be a little bit earthy. And it can be really pungent on the palate. Well, we talked about bold with bold, powerful with powerful. A sweet wine has a lot of power to it, right? In terms of its intensity and in terms of its kind of texture and structure on the palate. But also, a lot of these styles of sweet wine are also intense in their flavor and their aroma. We make a lot of these styles of sweet wine from concentrated grapes that concentrate the flavor, concentrate the sugar, right? And we're pairing that with a sort of pungent style of cheese. So we're talking about Stilton, Roquefort, Cambozola, Gorgonzola, Fourme d'Ambert, Cabrales, of course. So if you really like, for example, blue cheese, these sweet wines that have a lot of power to them will actually temper and soften that blue cheese. So this might be a really great pairing for somebody who's not certain if they like blue or not. Maybe somebody that's open to a new palate adventure. They want to try blue cheese, but they're a little bit put off by the flavor. You can pair this with a sweet wine and it will really help temper that. But if you're someone who loves blue cheese and you want to taste all of that saltiness, all of that bitterness, all of that kind of funky earthiness, you might choose to pair it with a dry wine that will actually intensify that. Maybe something like, Merlot that has a little bit of richness and softness in the palate that won't overwhelm, will really pair pretty well. So sweet wine doesn't tend to go as well with goat and sheep cheese. Aside from the style of blue cheese, it can also be really great with aged cheeses. So I would recommend Sherry, Port, Madeira, Banyuls, Sauterne, Tokay, Rutherglen, Muscat that come from Australia. We can definitely recommend these things also with other aged style of cheeses. So, Tome de Savoie, we talked about those aged. Think about aged Manchego with sort of a sweeter style of sherry, right? Like a cream sherry or a Pedro Jimenez sherry would be really fantastic. Or with a port or Madeira, could be really great as well. I saw a couple questions pop up. Oh, and I didn't mention, so sweet sparkling wine. That's the other thing I want to mention too. Oh, hi Scott. I didn't see you sign in. Blue cheese with the Turley Zen. I love that. Fantastic. So most of you are chatting with each other and fantastic. Good. All right. Let's see. So I wanted to talk about sweet sparkling wine, right? I love sweet sparkling wine. And I'll tell you why. One, because I like to drink. And so I oftentimes look for wines that are lower in alcohol. And, depending like things like sparkling sweet wine coming from Northern Italy, things like Asti, Moscato d'Asti, right? Or things like Barchetto, sparkling sweet style of kind of red or pink wine can also be really fantastic with blue cheeses. So again, they have a little bit more acidity because they're sparkling. They'll hold up to the sugar in the wine, to hold up to the kind of funkiness of the cheeses. But also they tend to be low in alcohol. And I really like that. So if you're thinking like you want to have a cheese plate, but you've already, for dessert, but you've already had a dinner party with, 1, 3, 4 bottles of wine on the table, and you want to finish off with something, finishing with a sparkling wine that has a little bit of sweetness, a lot of acidity, and low alcohol, like Asti, like Moscato d'Asti, can be really fantastic. You can get fantastic styles from producers like Vietti, do a really great job, really well-known producers in this area. So don't overlook the styles of that, or wines like Bougie Sardone, coming from Savoie in France, also kind of a sparkling, slightly sweet style of wine coming from a rosé wine coming from Eastern France. So why did we pick the wines we picked today? Well, because again, like I mentioned, if we were doing this class at Corkbuzz like we used to do pre-pandemic, we would select 6 wines to go with 6 different cheeses. And how do we select these wines and cheeses? Well, we really use our theory, meaning we take what we know about food and wine pairing, we take what we know about certain grape varieties, their texture and their flavor, what we know about specific cheeses, their texture and their flavor. And first we say, I think these 6 cheeses will go really well with these 6 wines. Now, because we want to provide the best experience, often at Corkbuzz, we would choose cheeses that we have in-house already because we know they're fantastic. And usually we would select from wines by the glass, because what this allowed us to do was to actually pair the food or the wine and the cheese perfectly, right? And kind of give you that experience. And then you would also get to learn about general food and wine pairing, but then you would get to taste it. In the virtual format, unfortunately, we don't have the opportunity to do that, but I want to give you the tools to do that at home. So we really picked 2 wines that we were hoping would go with most of the cheeses that you have on your plate and allow you to experiment across the different styles that you enjoy. Now, I like an oak style of Chardonnay. This is not oaked in the sense that it has oak to add flavor. So the Domaine de la Renardier is coming from a single commune known as Poupillon, the smaller appellation within the larger area of Arbois in the Jura. So we're over in eastern France here. The wine is aged in, both fermented and aged in Foudre and Barrique, but they're used. So they're not really meant to add a lot of flavor to the wine. They're really just meant to enhance sort of the texture and actually change the flavor, although not add flavor, of the wine from being a very fresh, fruit-forward Chardonnay to something that's a little bit more savory and earthy. And if anybody here has been to Eastern France, if you've been to the Jura, if you've been to Savoie, you've been to this area, it's very bucolic. There's a lot of livestock here. You see cows, especially, all over the place. And cheese is really important here. So a lot of the wines that are made within this area really go well with the Tome de Savoie, the Morbier, the local cheeses that you get coming from this particular area. And I think that this is no exception. I like that it has a little bit more of a savory character, but because it's Chardonnay, it does have a little bit of richness to it. There's a little bit of a creaminess. It's not really a really buttery Chardonnay, but you do get a little creaminess, richness on the palate, but it still retains a lot of sharpness from the acidity. So I think it both pairs as effortlessly with the richer cheeses as it cuts through them with the acidity too. So the newer domain, founded in the 90s. They've been organic since 2003, I think certified since 2012, but practicing organic since 2003. He makes 3 different Chardonnays, and they're meant to show the three different terroirs. So the Jurassique, which you're drinking, comes from the limestone terroir. This commune, this area that's known as Arbois Poupien, this is a limestone outcropping. So most of the Jura is actually marl, and Arbois is marl, but you have this little limestone outcropping, these really beautiful, bright, lifted wines in terms of their acidity. I'd love to hear what you enjoyed with that. So I like that, Scott, you mentioned, or Angelique, you said you like the Turley with blue cheese, and I'm glad you said that because if you like blue cheese, you'd probably like that with these more red wines. They don't have to be sweet, right? But Turley is still a powerful style of wine. Zinfandel ripens unevenly, so it has these slightly jammy characteristics to it when you drink the wine, but it's not sweet. So here we're talking about Turley. It's one of our favorite wineries to talk about, one of our favorite winemakers. They were founded in 1993. Larry Turley previously worked for Frogleaf Wine Cellars with John Williams. He was actually a co-founder, sold his stake to John to found Turley Wine Cellars. And he founded Turley really to focus on especially old vine Zinfandel in California. Since they've been doing this, they've really become sort of the benefactors of helping to preserve these sort of unique old vine vineyards of Zinfandel, of Petit Syrah, and they really preserve this kind of unique winemaking culture and history around Zinfandel in California as well. So this is their old vine blend. It's composed of old vines from different sites around California that are either too small to be made into a single vineyard wine, or too new to the Turley way of farming. They do farm organically, to be made into their own single vineyard designate wine. So these are vines that are between 50 and 130 years old. It's a very true representation of California old vine Zinfandel. The grapes come from many of the different counties that you see old vines in Napa, Sonoma, Lodi, Contra Costa, Amador, Paso Robles, Mendocino. And this is a wine that you do see a little bit of new oak. So about 20%, most of the oak that they use is French, a little bit is American. I love this wine, particularly with all these different types of cheeses, because it has this rich palate. Because of the way that Zinfandel ripens, it has these sort of jammy notes to it, which is almost like, instead of using figs on your cheese plate, instead of having raisins on your cheese plate or jam, you have the wine, right? Are we pouring wine on our cheese plate? Of course we're not, but we're able to sort of recreate that experience with our palate by enjoying that cheese and that wine together. So what I want to leave you with today, experimentation is good. We all have our own personal preferences. We all have our own ideas of what we like together, what we don't. We learn the basic rules to use them as guides. We take the classic pairings and we expand on why they work to suit our own personal palate, right? If there's a dish or a wine that you love on its own, let that lead. Break down the flavors and the textures, and then pair the other component with it, meaning choose the wine and then pair the cheese, or choose the cheese you love and then pair the wine. It's not an exact science. Think about regional specialties. Again, what grows together goes together. And then, as we mentioned before, like, understand what's in season, take into account the weather. If I could be telling you that the best thing in the world to have together is Sauterne, sweet Sauterne and foie gras, but if you're sitting outside on a 95-degree day and like 85% humidity, probably the last thing you want to be drinking is sweet wine and eating seared foie gras, right? So even if those two things are fantastic together, think about the time of year, think about the weather, and also think about what's in season. Again, I could tell you that the best thing I've ever had in my life with wine and cheese is Windermere in February with let's say California Arnaud Roberts Grenache. But if you try to have those two things together sometime like August, you won't have the same experience. So really think about the seasonality of the cheese. Always ask your cheesemonger because they often will have some really great advice for you as well. And just like I always say, think about find someone you trust when it comes to wine. Find someone you trust when it comes to cheese too, right? Like if you're close to Murray's, if you're close to Saxelby's, if you're close to Brooklyn Cheese Shop, if you always go to a specific, Fairway or Whole Foods or wherever it is that you go with your cheese counter, ask them for just a small piece. Try different things. Find someone that you trust, and let them get to know your palate so that they might be able to recommend new experiences for you as well. All right, lovely seeing all of you. And I see, cool. So if there any questions that I missed, what would be a good cheese? So with Burgundy, a lot of people do like Epoix, which is kind of a funky washed rind cheese of the region. You have a little bit of the fruitiness and slight funkiness from red Burgundy. You get that in Epoix as well. It might exacerbate a little bit of those funky flavors. So depending on how much you like that, you would make that decision. But also, I hope when Murray's opens again, they do some really fun stuff with food and wine pairings. All right, thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
All right, I hope you have a wonderful night. Kind of looking through, seeing if there's any other questions, but I'm happy that you are chatting with each other. Enjoy cheese, enjoy wine. We've been having a lot of it the past year. If you have any questions, let me know. I'll be sending out the recording and some follow-up notes tomorrow, but I hope everybody has a great night. All right. Enjoy your cheese, enjoy your company. The best pairing is always who you're with, and have fun tonight.